So normally, La Fin Du Monde comes in these bigger 750 milliliter kind of champagne bottles. You got the cork up there, you pop it like a bottle of champagne. So people kind of associate a lot of Unibroue's beers almost as being champagne-like. Do you have any idea what gives Unibroue beers that extra carbonation?
Yes, that's a great question. And the reason is that, as it says here on the bottle fermented. What does that mean? Well, we all know that beer gets through a fermentation process in order to become beer. And the main agent that makes the fermentation possible is yeast. And what yeast does is very simple. It eats the sugar that is present in the malt and it transforms it into CO2, carbonation, and alcohol. If you do add some yeast in the bottle before you bottle it, the yeast is still active and it's going to keep eating the residual sugar that is left and keep fermenting the beer and adding more carbonation inside of the bottle. So that's what's creating that extra carbonation that you see when you pour the beer that makes it look like champagne.
That's pretty amazing. So for anybody who makes dough, let's say, Alessandro, you actually taught me how to make pizza dough a little while ago. So this is something that I love playing around with now, making my own pizza dough, making my own bread. It's the same thing. When you start making the dough and you let it sit, the longer you let it sit for the yeast to kind of activate and eat the proteins there, it gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, and your dough just puffs up more and more and more. So I guess it's kind of the same concept. It's almost like the beer is puffing up inside the bottle. The longer you leave it there, the yeast is eating away.
It is. And it's actually making bread and beer are very similar in the fact that they both use yeast in the process. And the difference is obviously that when you make bread, you're trying to trap that carbonation inside of the dough. The dough is like trapping it, and that's what's creating those bubbles. Those are just bubbles of CO2. So the process is actually the same. That's why a lot of times you hear talking about beer as liquid bread. It's in fact like the same thing, but it's a little bit more fun, right?
Man, we might have to make a separate cooking channel at one point. We should look into that. You guys don't know yet, but Alessandro is quite the chef. He's quite the good teacher too. He's taught me quite a few things over the days, not just pizza dough, to make homemade pasta, a whole assortment of things. Maybe there's something coming down the line.
I mean, if there's still beer involved, I'm in.
Oh my God, of course there's gonna be beer involved. Come on, beer and cooking.
Yes, I like that.
So do they actually, there's a rumor that they use champagne yeast. Is this a fact or not?
Yes, it actually is. They use champagne yeast in the production of La Fin Du Monde. And one of the fun and interesting thing about yeast is that you might think of it as just like, something generic. You just go in the grocery store and you buy that and that's it. But there's actually many different families and types of yeast that exist. One of the biggest and most important distinction is if you're producing ales or if you're producing lagers. Those use two main strain of yeast when it's coming down to beer production. Champagne, wine production use a different strain of yeast. So when you're using yeast, this also, while it does like the main job, which is like changing sugar into CO2 and alcohol, it also imparts different flavors depending on what type of yeast you're using. And those flavors usually are referred to as esters that you can also smell into the beer. So the fact that they're using champagne yeast is producing a little bit more of that toasty, bakery kind of aroma that you can actually smell in the beer the moment you get your nose into the glass.
Oh man, you really can. You really can. This explains so much for me. I was always wondering why specifically beers like La Fin Du Monde, but most of Unibroue's beers almost have that champagne quality to them. So that just completely explains it.